Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. Your support helps us bring you more stories like this. Now, let us begin. Eva Herman was born in Germany and later emigrated to the United States with her husband, Charles Herman, seeking stability and opportunity. By the latter half of the 19th century, the couple had settled in Buffalo, New York, a city with a large and well-established German immigrant population. They lived at number 23 Blossom Alley, renting the second floor of a modest two-story brick house located within Buffalo's German district. The neighborhood was centered around streets such as Broadway, Jefferson, and Main, where German families had formed a close-knit community with their own churches, schools, and businesses. The Hermans' landlady, Mrs. Lucy Nunnold, occupied the ground floor of the house. Elderly and well-known within the local German community, she was familiar with the daily habits of her tenants. Eva Herman was regarded as a respectable and diligent woman who took her responsibilities seriously. In order to support the household, she worked at a fruit stand operated by Christopher Ziegler in one of Buffalo's public markets. Her earnings were essential, as they covered rent and household expenses. Charles Herman, who had once worked as a butcher, was unemployed during this period. He spent much of his time idle and increasingly relied on alcohol. A significant portion of Eva's income was consumed by his drinking. When intoxicated, Charles became suspicious and jealous, particularly toward Eva's employer, whom he accused of improper familiarity. These tensions affected the household deeply. Although the residence appeared orderly from the outside, the marriage inside had become strained, unstable, and marked by frequent disputes that steadily eroded domestic peace. Life inside the Herman household had, by the mid-1880s, become increasingly turbulent. Charles Herman's dependence on alcohol played a central role in shaping the atmosphere of the home. When sober, he was described as idle and withdrawn, but when drinking, his behavior often turned hostile and confrontational. Alcohol intensified his jealousy and fueled his suspicions, particularly regarding Eva's work at the fruit stand and her interactions with her employer. These suspicions, unsupported by any evidence, became a frequent source of arguments between husband and wife. The disputes were rarely contained within the walls of the apartment. Neighbors living nearby had grown accustomed to loud quarrels coming from the second floor of the house at 23 Blossom Alley. Voices raised in anger, accusations, and prolonged shouting were common occurrences. By 1885, the household was widely regarded as one dominated by resentment rather than harmony. The repeated disturbances had become part of the building's routine, no longer drawing surprise, only quiet concern. Mrs. Lucy Nunnold, who lived below the Hermans, was well aware of the discord. As their landlady, she observed Charles Herman's frequent intoxication and erratic conduct. She regarded Eva as hard-working and respectable, while viewing Charles as unreliable and prone to quarrels. His reputation for drunken behavior was known not only within the house, but also among those in the surrounding neighborhood. This pattern of conflict continued unchecked. Financial strain, fueled by Charles's unemployment and drinking, placed additional pressure on the marriage. These ongoing tensions culminated in a particularly heated argument on Sunday, November 1st, an incident remembered clearly by Mrs. Nunnold, and noted as the last disturbance heard before Eva Herman's unexplained absence. Following the heated argument on Sunday, November 1st, Eva Herman was no longer seen in or around the house at 23 Blossom Alley. In the days that followed, Charles Herman continued to leave and return as usual, giving no outward indication that anything was amiss. The apartment, however, remained unusually quiet. By Wednesday, November 4th, Mrs. Lucy Nunnold became increasingly concerned by Eva's absence, noting that she had not seen her tenant for several days. Given Eva's consistent work habits and sense of responsibility, this absence appeared unusual and troubling. That morning, when Charles left the house once again, Mrs. Nunnold decided to investigate. She went upstairs to the Hermans' rooms and knocked on the door, but received no response. Finding the door locked, she forced it open. Inside, she was confronted with a grim scene. Eva Herman lay dead on the bed. Her throat had been cut. Mrs. Nunnold immediately raised the alarm and the police were summoned. Officers arrived shortly afterward and observed a scene marked by violence. There was a considerable amount of blood on the floor, and signs of a struggle were clearly visible throughout the small upstairs apartment. Eva Herman's body lay motionless, bearing evidence of a fatal attack. Mrs. Nunald gave a statement to the police describing Eva as a respectable and hard-working woman, and Charles as a man known for heavy drinking and frequent quarrels. News of the death spread quickly through the surrounding neighborhood. Speculation followed. Some believed Charles Herman had killed his wife and fled, while others suggested Eva, overwhelmed by her circumstances, may have taken her own life. Medical examination of Eva Herman's body provided clarity where speculation had grown. Dr. Edwards conducted a post-mortem examination and focused on the physical condition and positioning of the body. He determined that Eva Herman had been dead for approximately 90 hours by the time she was discovered, noting visible signs of decomposition that supported this estimate. This finding placed the time of death well before Wednesday morning and aligned with the period following the argument heard on Sunday evening. Dr. Edwards examined the fatal wound and the surrounding scene with care. Eva's throat had been cut with a sharp instrument, and a razor was found on the floor near the bed. The position of the body, along with the placement of the razor, became central to his conclusions. After considering these factors, he stated that it would have been impossible for Eva Herman to have inflicted the injury upon herself. The nature of the wound and the physical circumstances ruled out suicide. With this medical determination, uncertainty surrounding the cause of death came to an end. What had briefly been a matter of rumor and conflicting opinion was now formally recognized as murder. Dr. Edwards's findings removed any remaining doubt and established that Eva Herman's death was the result of a violent act committed by another person. This conclusion had an immediate impact on the investigation. Attention shifted fully toward locating Charles Herman, who was no longer present at the residence. Police recognized the urgency of finding him and moved quickly to alert law enforcement throughout Buffalo. His description was circulated, and officers were instructed to search the areas he was known to frequent. Once Eva Herman's death was confirmed as murder, police efforts focused on locating her husband, Charles Herman. Law enforcement officers across Buffalo were alerted, and his description was circulated to police stations throughout the city. Patrolmen and detectives were instructed to pay particular attention to the neighborhoods and establishments Charles was known to frequent. Despite these efforts, several hours passed without success, increasing concern about his whereabouts. The breakthrough came through the vigilance of Joseph Wright, an off-duty police officer. Wright had previously lived in the same house as Charles Herman and was familiar with his habits, including the saloons he regularly visited. At approximately 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Wright located Herman at the Terrace Saloon on Pearl Street. Herman was visibly intoxicated at the time. After confirming his identity, Officer Wright took Charles Herman into custody and notified Captain Kavanaugh and Sergeant Kennedy. Herman was then brought before Superintendent Hill, where he was informed that he had been arrested in connection with the murder of his wife, Eva Herman. Upon hearing this, Herman appeared shocked and denied any knowledge of her death. When he had sobered, police presented him with the razor found at the scene. Herman identified it as his own. He also admitted that he had wiped his hands on a blood-stained cloth discovered in the apartment. Despite these admissions, he continued to deny responsibility for the killing and questioned details about the position in which his wife's body had been found. As the investigation continued, officers gathered further statements, including detailed observations from Mrs. Lucy Nunald regarding Herman's movements in and out of the house during the nights following Sunday. Police investigators believed that Eva Herman had been killed on the evening of Sunday, November 1st, during the period when Mrs. Lucy Nunald was away attending church. This conclusion was based on medical findings and on accounts of Charles Herman's movements in the days that followed. Mrs. Nunald stated that Herman continued coming and going from the house, returning late at night in a drunken state. Investigators concluded that for 3 consecutive nights, he entered the room where his wife's body remained and slept there without raising any alarm. After a night in custody, Charles Herman was subjected to further questioning. Under sustained pressure, he eventually admitted to killing his wife. He told officers that on Sunday evening, Eva had informed him she was going out, but refused to say where she was going. According to Herman, this refusal enraged him. He stated that he threw her to the floor and, in a moment of uncontrolled anger, drew a razor from his pocket and cut her throat. He explained that the cuts on her hands and scratches on her neck were the result of her attempts to defend herself during the struggle. Herman claimed that after the attack, he placed Eva on the bed, locked the room, and left the house to drink. He said that when he returned later, he went straight to bed and made no effort to check her condition, believing she was merely angry. Investigators found this account inconsistent with the physical evidence. They concluded that Eva's body had remained on the floor until Monday, when it was placed on the bed, contradicting Herman's statement. Superintendent Phillips questioned Herman again, during which Herman clearly repeated that he had killed his wife between 7 and 8 o'clock on Sunday evening. Following this admission, Herman was formally charged with murder. An inquest jury later concluded that he had unlawfully killed Eva Herman and should be held for trial. The trial of Charles Herman began on December 21st before Judge Daniels. Due to intense public interest, more than 100 potential jurors were questioned before 12 impartial men were selected. The courtroom was crowded, and anticipation surrounded each stage of the proceedings. Charles Herman was represented by attorney Leroy Andrus, who prepared a defense focused on challenging the prosecution's interpretation of events. The first witness called was the coroner, Mr. Scott. He testified that he arrived at number 23 Blossom Alley on the morning of Wednesday, November 4th, and observed the body of a woman in the apartment rented by Charles and Eva Herman. He stated that her throat had been cut, and that blood was present on the clothing and floor. The defense objected to testimony regarding blood, arguing no scientific testing had confirmed its nature. The judge overruled the objection after the coroner stated he could distinguish blood from paint. Dr. Edward Clark, who performed the post-mortem examination, testified next. He described the wounds found on Eva Herman and stated that death had been caused by hemorrhage from a sharp instrument. When court reconvened the following day, the crowd outside had grown so large that officers were forced to turn spectators away. Mrs. Lucy Nunnold then testified through an interpreter. She described the household, Eva's work history, and an earlier incident in which Charles, while intoxicated, threatened to throw a brick toward the window. The defense objected, but the judge allowed the testimony. The defense attempted to question Herman's mental state, suggesting his confession was unreliable. However, Dr. Floyd Crego testified that Herman was of sound mind. The defense chose not to place Herman on the stand, and the trial concluded on December 28th. After the conclusion of the trial, the jury deliberated for 20 hours before returning a verdict. Charles Herman was found guilty of first-degree murder. Judge Daniels then sentenced him to death by hanging. An appeal was made to Governor Hill, who reviewed the evidence but declined to interfere, confirming the sentence and setting the date for execution. In the days leading up to the hanging, newspapers revisited the case in detail. Reports described Herman as a man who had lived off his wife's labor, relying on her income to sustain his household and support his drinking. Articles highlighted the particularly disturbing aspect of the crime, noting that Herman had slept for several nights in the same bed with the body of the wife he had murdered. These accounts emphasized both the gravity of the act and the extent of his disregard for the consequences. On the day of the execution, Charles Herman was brought to the scaffold. Observers noted a change in his demeanor. His shoulders slumped slightly, and he appeared momentarily weighed by the enormity of his actions. For a brief period, he seemed less a figure of horror and more an individual confronting the reality of his own deeds. Without further ceremony, the trapdoor was released. Charles Herman was hanged, and his final moments passed in silence. The execution marked the completion of legal proceedings and brought closure to the case. With Herman's death, the matter of Eva Herman's murder was formally concluded, leaving only the historical record of the crime and its consequences for the city of Buffalo, the witnesses involved, and the community that had followed the case closely.